I never thought I'd see my daughter cry the way she did that Tuesday evening. Emma had always been my fighter, my brave little warrior who faced the world with a smile even after we lost her father 3 years ago. But that night when she walked through our apartment door, something was different. Her shoulders were hunched, her backpack dragging behind her like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and her eyes, those beautiful hazel eyes that reminded me so much of her father, were red and swollen. "Emma? Baby, what happened?" I asked, immediately abandoning the budget reports I'd been reviewing at our small kitchen table. She didn't answer. She just dropped her backpack, kicked off her worn sneakers, the ones I'd been meaning to replace but hadn't quite saved enough for yet, and walked straight to her room. The door didn't slam. That would have been better. Instead, it closed with this quiet, defeated click that sent ice through my veins. I gave her a few minutes, my heart pounding as I stood outside her door. Through the thin walls of our modest 2-bedroom apartment, I could hear her muffled sobs. Each one felt like a knife twisting in my chest. As a single mother working my way up from administrative assistant to school superintendent over 15 years, I'd sacrificed everything to give Emma a good life. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And we had hope. Always hope. Finally, I knocked softly. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm coming in." She didn't protest, which worried me even more. My 12-year-old daughter, who usually guarded her privacy like a dragon guarding treasure, just let me enter without a word. She was lying on her bed, face buried in her pillow, her homework scattered across her desk untouched. I sat down beside her, gently placing my hand on her back. "Talk to me, baby. What happened at school today?" For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she turned over and looked at me. The pain in her eyes made my breath catch. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking, "do you think we're poor?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What? Emma, where is this coming from?" "Mrs. Victoria Henderson," she said, and something in the way she spoke that name, with such bitterness from someone so young, made my blood run cold. "My new English teacher. She said things today, in front of everyone." Mrs. Victoria Henderson. I'd heard that name before in the district meetings. The veteran teacher transferred from Northbridge Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in the state, now teaching 7th grade English at Lincoln Middle School. She came with impeccable credentials, glowing recommendations, and a reputation for excellence. She was supposed to be one of our best acquisitions. "What kind of things, Emma?" I asked carefully, though rage was already building in my chest like a storm gathering strength. Emma sat up, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "Today in class, we had to write about our weekend. I wrote about how we went to the library on Saturday and then made homemade pizza for dinner. Remember? It was fun." Her voice broke. But when Mrs. Henderson read my paper, she stopped in the middle of the classroom and looked at me with this expression, like I was dirty or something. What did she say? I could barely get the words out. She asked me in front of the whole class if my family couldn't afford to go to real cultural activities like museums or restaurants. She said that children from disadvantaged backgrounds often lack exposure to refined experiences and that it shows in their writing. Everyone started laughing, Mom. Jake Morrison called me pizza box poor and said no wonder I always wear the same jacket. My hands were shaking now. I clasped them together, trying to maintain composure for Emma's sake, but inside I was fracturing. Did she say anything else? Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face again. When I tried to defend myself, I told her that we go to the library because I love reading and that we make pizza because it's our tradition, something Dad used to do with us. She said that making do with free entertainment and home-cooked meals because of limited financial resources was nothing to be defensive about, but that I should try to aspire to more in my writing. She said it loud enough for everyone to hear. I pulled Emma into my arms, holding her tight as she sobbed against my shoulder. Over her head, I stared at the wall, my mind racing. As school superintendent for the entire district, I'd dedicated my career to creating inclusive, supportive learning environments. I'd implemented anti-bullying policies, diversity training, and strict protocols against discrimination of any kind. And now, a teacher I'd personally approved hiring, was humiliating my daughter for our socioeconomic status. Emma, listen to me, I said, pulling back to look at her. There is nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with who we are or how we live. Your father would be so proud of the amazing person you've become. We choose the library because books are treasures. And we make pizza because cooking together creates memories that money can't buy. Do you understand me? She nodded, but I could see the damage had been done. The confidence I'd worked so hard to build in her had been shattered by a few cruel words from someone who was supposed to nurture and protect her. "I'm going to handle this," I said firmly. "But I need you to be honest with me. Is this the first time Mrs. Henderson has said something like this?" Emma hesitated, then shook her head. "Last week she made a comment about my jacket being well worn and suggested I ask my parents about getting something more presentable. And yesterday, when I couldn't afford the $20 fee for the class field trip right away, she announced to everyone that not all families can prioritize educational experiences and that perhaps I should stay behind." That was it. That was the moment everything changed. I'd spent my entire career being careful, being diplomatic, playing by the rules. But this wasn't about policy anymore. This was about my daughter. This was about every child who'd ever been made to feel less than Mrs. Victoria Henderson had no idea who she was dealing with. And tomorrow, she was going to find out. That night, I barely slept. After Emma finally drifted off, exhausted from crying, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The blue light from the screen illuminated my face as I pulled up Mrs. Victoria Henderson's personnel file. It was time to know exactly who was teaching my daughter and tormenting her. Victoria Henderson, age 47, 23 years of teaching experience. Previously employed at Northbridge Academy for 18 years before transferring to our public school district 6 months ago. Master's degree in English literature from Columbia. Her letters of recommendation were indeed impressive, but as I read more carefully, something began to stand out. The praise was always about her academic rigor and her students' test scores, never about warmth, never about creating a supportive classroom environment, never about connecting with students on a human level. I dug deeper into the transfer records, information I had access to as superintendent but rarely reviewed in such detail. That's when I found it, a confidential note from Northbridge Academy's headmaster. The language was carefully diplomatic, as these things always were, but the message was clear. Mrs. Henderson had been encouraged to seek new opportunities after several parent complaints regarding classroom atmosphere and communication style. The complaints had been settled quietly, as they often were in private schools where reputation was everything. No formal disciplinary action, no red flags in her permanent record, just a quiet nudge out the door with glowing recommendations to preserve everyone's dignity. My jaw clenched. They'd passed the problem along to us. To a public school where children from all backgrounds came to learn, where many families were struggling, where a teacher's compassion mattered just as much as their credentials. And we'd welcomed her with open arms, grateful to have someone with such an impressive resume. I cross-referenced her name with our internal incident report system. Nothing official had been filed, but I found something else. Informal notes from other teachers. Mrs. Caldwell, the school counselor, had mentioned in passing during a staff meeting that some students in Mrs. Henderson's class seem unusually anxious. Mr. Patterson, who taught in the classroom next door, had noted that he'd heard raised voices and what sounded like public shaming through the walls several times. These were observations, not formal complaints, but they painted a disturbing picture. At 2 a.m., I made a decision. I couldn't approach this as Emma's mother. Not directly, not yet. If I stormed into that school tomorrow revealing my personal connection, Mrs. Henderson could claim bias, file a grievance, muddy the waters with union protections and procedural challenges. I'd seen it happen before. Teachers who'd committed fireable offenses walking away with barely a slap on the wrist because the process wasn't followed perfectly. No, this required strategy. This required me to be the superintendent first and the mother second, as much as that killed me inside. I sent an email to my assistant marked urgent, to be read first thing in the morning. Please schedule a routine classroom observation of Mrs. Victoria Henderson's classes this week, unannounced. Include observations from multiple periods to get a comprehensive view. Also, compile any parent or student feedback we've received about her teaching style since she started. I want everything. Then I did something I'd never done before. I created an anonymous parent feedback account, something we'd set up years ago to allow families to report concerns without fear of retaliation. And I wrote a detailed complaint about Mrs. Henderson's treatment of Emma. I didn't mention that Emma was my daughter. I wrote it as if I were any parent in the district concerned about their child's well-being. I included specific quotes, dates, and incidents, everything Emma had told me. By 3 a.m., I had a plan, a multi-pronged approach that would build an airtight case while protecting Emma from further harm. First, the anonymous complaint would trigger a standard investigation, protocol I'd written myself. Second, the classroom observations would provide objective evidence of her teaching methods. Third, I'd quietly reach out to other parents in Emma's class to see if their children had experienced similar treatment. And fourth, and this was the part that made my heart race with something between fear and anticipation, I would make an unexpected visit to Emma's class myself. Not as her mother, as the superintendent doing a routine school visit. Mrs. Henderson had never met me in person. Our district was large with 12 schools under my supervision. Superintendent visits to individual classrooms weren't common, but they weren't unheard of either. I could observe her teaching firsthand, see how she interacted with students, and watch her in her element without her knowing the parent of one of her victims was in the room. The thought made my hands tremble with barely contained rage, but I forced myself to stay calm. Strategic. This was a chess game, and I needed to think several moves ahead. At 4 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood run cold. It was from Diane Porter, another single mother I'd befriended at the district's Parent-Teacher Association meetings. Her daughter, Sophie, was also in Emma's class. "Sarah, are you awake? I know it's late, but Sophie just had a nightmare. She was crying about her English teacher. Says the teacher called her culturally unsophisticated in class today because Sophie didn't know what a summer in the Hamptons meant. Is everything okay with Emma? Sophie mentioned something happened to her today, too." My hands shook as I typed my response. This wasn't just about Emma. This was bigger. How many children had Victoria Henderson been systematically humiliating? How many kids were going home in tears, their confidence shattered, their love of learning poisoned by a teacher who thought cruelty was somehow pedagogical? "Let's have coffee tomorrow morning before school," I typed back. "Early. We need to talk." Within minutes, I had responses from 2 other mothers I knew whose children were in the same class. They'd all been lying awake, comforting crying children, wondering if they should say something but afraid of making things worse, afraid that complaining about a teacher might make their children targets. The pattern was clear, and it was worse than I'd imagined. As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink outside my kitchen window, I sat surrounded by notes, files, and evidence. I hadn't slept, but I was more focused than I'd been in years. This wasn't just about protecting Emma anymore. This was about protecting every child who'd ever walked into Victoria Henderson's classroom and been made to feel small. Mrs. Henderson had made a catastrophic mistake. She'd targeted the wrong child. And now, she was about to discover that some parents, some mothers, don't just fight back. They dismantle, piece by piece, strategically, thoroughly. The game had begun. The coffee shop was nearly empty at 6:30 a.m. when I arrived. Diane was already there, dark circles under her eyes, clutching a mug like it was a lifeline. Within minutes, Rachel Chen and Maria Rodriguez joined us. 3 mothers united by the same nightmare, all afraid to speak up but desperate for someone to listen. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, keeping my voice low despite the empty space around us. They didn't know I was the superintendent. To them, I was just Sarah Mitchell, single mom, working professional, fellow warrior in the trenches of raising kids. And for now, that's exactly who I needed to be. "Sophie barely slept," Diane whispered, her voice breaking. "She kept asking me why her teacher hates her. What do you say to that? How do you explain to a 12-year-old that sometimes people are just cruel?" Rachel leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly. "My daughter Jessica stopped raising her hand in English class 3 weeks ago. She used to love reading, loved discussing books. Now she comes home and begs me not to make her participate. Yesterday, Mrs. Henderson apparently mocked her interpretation of a poem, told the class that not everyone has the cultural framework to understand literature, and that Jessica's response showed limited exposure to refined thinking." My stomach turned. "Did Jessica tell you this directly?" "She didn't want to," Rachel said, tears welling up. "She thought I'd be disappointed in her. Can you imagine? My brilliant daughter thought she'd failed somehow, that she wasn't smart enough when really this teacher was just bullying her," Maria finished, her voice hard with anger. "Let's call it what it is. My son Carlos showed me his essay yesterday. He'd written about helping his abuela at her restaurant on weekends. Mrs. Henderson gave him a C- and wrote in red ink that his choice of subject matter reflected limited aspirations and that he should explore topics beyond manual labor. He's 12. He's proud of his grandmother's restaurant, and this woman turned it into something shameful." I pulled out my notebook, the one I'd been carrying since 3 a.m. "I need you all to write everything down. Every incident, every comment, every time your child came home upset. Dates, specific quotes if you remember them, witnesses, everything. "What are you going to do?" Diane asked, hope flickering in her exhausted eyes. I chose my words carefully. "I work in the district office. I have some connections, but I need documentation. I need evidence that this is a pattern, not just isolated incidents. Can you do that?" They all nodded, determination replacing the helplessness on their faces. As they wrote, I listened to their stories. The picture that emerged was devastating. Victoria Henderson had been systematically targeting children from working-class families, single-parent homes, immigrant backgrounds, anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable. She'd mock their weekend activities if they weren't expensive enough, critique their clothing if it wasn't designer, question their family's priorities if they couldn't afford field trips or special supplies. But she was clever about it. She never used explicitly discriminatory language, never said "you're poor" or "your family is inferior." Instead, she used coded phrases: limited resources, unfortunate circumstances, lack of exposure, cultural deficits. Phrases that sounded almost educational, almost concerned, but were delivered with a tone and context that made their true meaning unmistakable to everyone in the room. "She's got some kids completely fooled," Rachel added bitterly. "The wealthy ones, the ones whose parents donate to the school, whose families vacation in Europe. Those kids think she's amazing. They laugh along when she makes these comments, not realizing they're participating in something ugly, or maybe not caring." My phone buzzed. A message from my assistant. "Classroom observation scheduled for Mrs. Henderson, Thursday 2nd and 5th period. Principal Davidson will conduct. Also found 3 informal parent complaints in the system from last month that were never escalated. Forwarding to you now." Perfect. The machine was in motion. "Ladies," I said, gathering the pages they'd written, "I promise you this is going to be addressed, but I need you to do something else for me. Don't tell your children yet that you're taking action. I don't want Mrs. Henderson to know a complaint is coming. Can you do that?" They agreed, though I could see how much it hurt them to send their kids back into that classroom even for a few more days. I understood. Every minute Emma spent in Victoria Henderson's presence felt like an eternity, but I needed to do this right. One misstep, one procedural error, and she could slip through our fingers. After the mothers left, I sat alone in the coffee shop and opened the complaints my assistant had sent. They were heartbreaking. Parents who'd reached out tentatively, describing their children's experiences, asking if maybe they were overreacting, wondering if perhaps the teacher's methods were just old school or rigorous. Each complaint had been received by the school's front office and then nothing. No follow-up, no investigation. They'd fallen through the cracks of a busy administrative system. But why? I dug into the email trails and found my answer. Each time a complaint came in, it had been routed to Principal Davidson, and each time he'd sent the same response. "Mrs. Henderson is a highly credentialed educator with an excellent track record. Her teaching methods may seem strict, but her students consistently perform well on standardized tests. I will speak with her about communication style." My jaw clenched. He'd known. He'd known there were problems and had swept them under the rug because her students' test scores looked good on paper, because she made the school's statistics shine, because addressing the problem would require effort, investigation, potential conflict with the teachers' union. I pulled up Principal Davidson's file next. Richard Davidson, 20 years as an educator, 5 as principal of Lincoln Middle School. His performance reviews were adequate but not exceptional. He avoided conflict, prioritized appearances over substance, and had a troubling pattern of protecting problem teachers as long as they delivered results. 2 targets now, the teacher and the principal who'd enabled her. I spent the next hour drafting a formal memorandum to the school board, outlining the complaints, the pattern of behavior, and the failure of building-level administration to address the issue. I didn't mention Emma specifically, not yet. This was about systemic failure and the need for immediate corrective action. But there was one more thing I needed to do. The observation scheduled for Thursday was 2 days away. That was 2 more days of Emma and other children suffering. I couldn't wait. I called my assistant. "Change of plans. I'm conducting a surprise superintendent visit to Lincoln Middle School today. All classes, all teachers, but I'll be spending extended time in 7th grade English. Don't notify the school. I want to see what really happens in those classrooms." There was a pause on the other end. "Ma'am, that's unusual. Principal Davidson will want to prepare." "That's exactly why we're not telling him," I cut in. "This is a superintendent's prerogative, random quality assurance. It's in my authority." Understood, my assistant said. I could hear the curiosity in her voice, but she knew better than to ask questions. What time should I tell your office you'll be out? All day, I said. This is going to take a while. I arrived at Lincoln Middle School at 9:45 a.m. during second period. The hallways were quiet, students tucked away in classrooms, the sound of muffled voices and occasional laughter seeping through closed doors. I'd been in hundreds of schools over my career, but walking through these halls knowing my daughter was somewhere inside, suffering, made everything feel different, more urgent, more personal. The security guard at the front desk looked up in surprise. Superintendent Mitchell, we weren't expecting... Unannounced visit, I said with a professional smile, showing my district ID. Just doing some quality assurance. Please don't alert anyone. I want to see normal operations. I could see the confusion on his face, but he nodded. District superintendents had the authority to enter any school unannounced. It was rare, usually reserved for serious concerns, but perfectly legal. My heels clicked against the linoleum as I made my way to the 7th grade wing. Through the small window in each door, I could see classrooms in action. Math equations on whiteboards, science experiments in progress, students taking notes, raising hands, engaging with their teachers, normal, healthy, what school should be. Then I reached room 247, Victoria Henderson's English class. Through the window, I could see her at the front of the room, impeccably dressed in an expensive-looking blazer and pearls, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was holding up a student's paper, and even from outside, I could see the condescending expression on her face. I opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The room fell silent immediately. 24 pairs of eyes turned toward me, including Emma's. I saw my daughter's eyes widen in shock, but to her credit, she didn't say anything, didn't gasp or call out. She just stared, questions written all over her face. Mrs. Henderson turned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. Can I help you? Please continue, I said smoothly, taking a position at the back of the room and pulling out my tablet. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, District Superintendent. I'm conducting classroom observations today. Pretend I'm not here. I watched the color drain from her face, then return as a flush of pink across her cheeks. Superintendent Mitchell, we weren't notified of any evaluation today. Surprise quality assurance, I said, my voice professionally pleasant but firm. Standard procedure. Please continue with your lesson. I'm just here to observe. She recovered her composure remarkably quickly, which told me she was used to performing for authority figures. Of course, we were just reviewing student essays on personal experiences. She held up the paper she'd been displaying. This particular essay demonstrates some of the challenges students face when their experiential base is limited. My blood ran cold, but I kept my expression neutral, typing notes on my tablet. The assignment was to write about a meaningful weekend activity, she continued, her voice taking on that particular tone I'd heard about, the one that sounded educational but carried cruelty underneath. This student wrote about going to a public library and eating dinner at home. While there's nothing inherently wrong with these activities, of course, they do reflect certain economic realities that can limit a student's ability to produce sophisticated narrative content. I looked at the name on the paper she was holding, Sophie Porter, Diane's daughter. The little girl who'd had nightmares last night was sitting in the 3rd row, her face burning red with humiliation as her teacher held up her work like evidence in a trial. Interesting observation, I said, my voice level. Can you elaborate on what makes an experience sophisticated versus limited? Mrs. Henderson seemed emboldened by what she perceived as my professional interest. Well, students who are exposed to cultural institutions, museums, theaters, fine dining experiences, naturally develop a more nuanced vocabulary and broader conceptual framework. They learn to observe details, to analyze their environments, to articulate complex thoughts. Students from more modest backgrounds often lack these advantages. I see, I typed furiously on my tablet. And how do you address this perceived deficit in your teaching? I try to expose them to what they're missing, she said, as if she were doing them a favor. I assign readings from classical literature. I discuss European cultural traditions. I encourage them to aspire beyond their current circumstances. By criticizing their family activities in front of their peers, the question came out sharper than I'd intended. Her smile faltered. I wouldn't characterize it as criticism. I'm simply providing honest feedback about the quality of their work. Show me Sophie's essay, I said, standing up and walking toward the front of the room. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, then handed it over. I read it silently, aware that every eye in the classroom was on me. Sophie had written about discovering a new book series at the library, about the excitement of finding all 3 volumes available and spending her afternoon lost in a world of adventure. She described making cookies with her little brother afterward, how the smell filled their apartment, how they'd laughed when the first batch burned slightly but ate them anyway. It was beautiful. It was genuine. It was full of joy and sensory details and love. Any competent teacher would have recognized the quality of the writing, the authentic voice, the emotional resonance. Mrs. Henderson had given it a C with comments in red ink. Limited scope. Consider exploring experiences beyond domestic settings. Your descriptions would benefit from exposure to more refined environments. This is excellent work, I said loudly enough for the whole class to hear. Sophie, this essay is engaging, well-structured, and full of vivid details that bring your experience to life. The way you described the feeling of anticipation waiting for the next chapter shows real literary awareness. Your teacher's comments don't reflect the quality of what you've written here. Sophie's head snapped up, tears in her eyes, hope flickering across her face. Mrs. Henderson's expression hardened. Superintendent Mitchell, with all due respect, I've been teaching English for 23 years. I think I know how to evaluate student work. Do you? I turned to face her fully. Because what I'm seeing here is a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes writing effective. This has nothing to do with where the experience took place or how much money was spent. This is about authentic voice, sensory detail, emotional truth, things Sophie demonstrated beautifully in her essay. The classroom was dead silent. Students were sitting up straighter, some of them beginning to smile. Furthermore, I continued, flipping through my tablet, I'm looking at your grading patterns from this semester. Students from families below the median income level in this district have an average grade in your class that's 0.8 points lower than students from families above the median. Care to explain that statistical anomaly? Her face went pale. I grade based solely on merit. Those students simply what? Are less intelligent? Work less hard? Or are they simply being graded on a scale that values wealth over talent? I never said they were less intelligent, she snapped, losing her composure. You didn't have to say it explicitly, but when you tell a child that their family limited, that their experiences lack sophistication, that their backgrounds create deficits, what exactly do you think they hear? What do you think their classmates hear? I walked slowly to Emma's desk. My daughter was staring at me with a mixture of awe and dawning understanding. I didn't look directly at her. I couldn't, not yet, or I'd lose the professional detachment I was barely maintaining. Let me be crystal clear, Mrs. Henderson, I said, turning back to face the teacher. This district serves children from all socioeconomic backgrounds. Diversity isn't just a buzzword for us, it's our strength. Every child, regardless of their family's income, deserves to feel valued and respected in their classroom. Every experience, whether it happens at a library or a luxury resort, has educational value when approached with curiosity and thoughtfulness. I understand that, but I'm not finished. My voice cut through her attempt to interrupt. What I've witnessed in the last 15 minutes, combined with documentation I've received, suggests a pattern of behavior that violates district policy on inclusive education and anti-bullying protocols. You will be placed on immediate administrative review pending a full investigation. The words hung in the air like a bomb. You can't do that. Mrs. Henderson's professional facade crumbled completely. I have tenure. I have union protection. One observation doesn't... This isn't about one observation, I said coldly. This is about multiple documented complaints, a statistical grading bias, and direct observation of classroom behavior that creates a hostile environment for students. Principal Davidson will meet with you after this class. You're suspended with pay pending investigation. I turned to the students, 24 young faces staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction to hope. Class, let me tell you something important, I said, softening my voice. Your worth as students, as people, has nothing to do with how much money your families have. Nothing. The best education in the world can't teach character, kindness, or creativity. Those things come from who you are, not what you can afford. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small for being yourself. I looked directly at Emma then, letting her see the mother behind the superintendent, just for a moment. Her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I'll send someone to cover the rest of this class period, I told Mrs. Henderson. Report to the principal's office immediately. As I walked out of that classroom, my hands were shaking, but for the first time in 3 days, I felt like I could breathe. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and revelations that shook Lincoln Middle School to its foundation. What I'd uncovered in Victoria Henderson's classroom turned out to be just the tip of an iceberg that had been growing beneath the surface for months. By Wednesday afternoon, my office had received 23 formal complaints from parents whose children were in Mrs. Henderson's classes. 23 families who'd been sitting on their pain and frustration, afraid to speak up, afraid their children would face retaliation, afraid they'd be dismissed as overreacting or too sensitive. The floodgates had opened, and the stories pouring in were devastating. I sat in my office with my assistant director, Marcus Chen, spreading out the documentation across my conference table like pieces of a puzzle that was finally taking shape. Each complaint told a similar story. A child excited about English class in September, gradually becoming withdrawn and anxious by November. Grades dropping not because of poor work quality but because of subjective evaluations that seemed to correlate directly with family income. Comments on papers that attacked not the writing but the lived experiences described within them. "This is worse than we thought," Marcus said, his face grim as he reviewed a complaint from a parent whose daughter had developed anxiety attacks before English class. "How did it get this far without anyone stopping it?" "Because Principal Davidson didn't want to rock the boat," I said, pulling up the email chains I'd recovered from the school's server. "Look at this. Every time a parent complained, he responded with essentially a pat on the head and a Mrs. Henderson is an excellent teacher with high standards script. He never investigated, never observed her classroom, never followed, he's finished," Marcus said flatly. "You can't ignore this many red flags and keep your position." I nodded, but there was no satisfaction in it. A principal losing his job meant disruption for the entire school. Students, teachers, staff, everyone would feel the impact. But what was the alternative? Let incompetent leadership continue to enable harm? My phone buzzed. A text from Diane. "Sophie actually volunteered in class today, first time in weeks, thank you." Another text, this one from Rachel. "Jessica asked if she could join the school literary magazine. I cried. Thank you for giving my daughter back her voice." These messages had been coming in steadily since Monday. Parents thanking me, not knowing that one of those students I'd protected was my own daughter. I hadn't told them yet. I would eventually, but right now it was more important that they understood this wasn't just about Emma. This was about systemic change. The investigation was moving quickly. I'd brought in an external consultant, a former principal with expertise in discrimination cases, to conduct interviews with students from all of Mrs. Henderson's classes. The consultant's preliminary report landed on my desk Wednesday evening, and it was damning. Out of 92 students interviewed across 3 class periods, 47 reported feeling uncomfortable or targeted based on their family's economic status. 18 students specifically mentioned comments about their clothing, activities, or family circumstances that made them feel ashamed or less than their peers. The consultant noted that Mrs. Henderson's teaching style created a 2-tier classroom environment where wealthy students were praised and encouraged while working-class students were subtly but consistently marginalized. But there was something else in the report that made my blood boil. Several of the wealthy students, the ones Mrs. Henderson favored, had internalized her biases. They'd admitted during interviews that they viewed their classmates from less affluent families as less educated or culturally unsophisticated. 12-year-olds repeating elitist rhetoric they'd learned from their teacher. The damage went beyond hurt feelings. She'd been actively teaching children to perpetuate class discrimination. Thursday morning, I called an emergency meeting with the school board. 7 members, all elected officials who oversaw district policy and had the authority to approve administrative actions. I'd worked with this board for 5 years, and while we didn't always agree, we shared a commitment to protecting students. I presented the evidence methodically, the complaints, the statistical grading analysis, the consultant's report, the transcript of what I'd observed in her classroom. I showed them videos of student interviews with parental permission where children described crying themselves to sleep, feeling stupid, losing their love of reading. I showed them Sophie's essay with Henderson's cruel comments scrawled across it in red ink. Board member Patricia Williams, a retired teacher herself, had tears streaming down her face by the end of the presentation. "How did we hire this person? How did she pass our screening?" "Her credentials were impeccable," I admitted. "Her references from Northbridge Academy were glowing. What we didn't know, what